College athletics underwent a major realignment in conferences about 10 years ago. Football, the driving force, therefore money, the underlying driving force and catalyst for those changes, which completely dismantled the Big East when it comes to football. We got Ryan Kantor on the line from Shaking the Southland. He's got a realignment for college football. I do as well, that I'm reconstructing from what I posted 3 years ago. So it should be interesting to see and match up our realignment. Ryan worked off the model of, I believe, 12 teams in each conference. Therefore, he wants uniformity across the board. No 10-team conferences, 14-team conferences, 12 teams per conference, 6, not 5, 6 major conferences. This should be mighty interesting to hear. Ryan, how you doing tonight?
Good. Thanks for having me. It should be a fun discussion.
Absolutely. I love this kind of stuff, and sports fans do as well, because we know that there are situations in college football that don't make sense, and the scheduling and the conference alignment would be one of them, because it's been moved and shaped by money. And of course, we had a major shakeup about 10 years ago, and we sit where we do with 10, 12, and 14 team conferences, but you're going to fix all that.
We're going to make it perfect. Not quite, but we're looking, keep in mind, this is future looking. Some grant of rights start running out around 2025. So I try not to pick teams that are just hot at the moment, trying to think a little bit broader about programs. We're talking 5 years out, something that could last a while. And kind of the assumption of this is that, in the last realignment, like you said, it's all about money. It was heavily about cable, TV, and big markets. This is more about history and rivalry and geographic proximity, as teams want to, not travel all over the country to pick up different TV markets for the Big Ten network and whatnot. Is all that's changing. So with that being said, we've got 12 or 6 conferences, 12 teams each. We'll assume each one gets an automatic bid, so they really need to have the same amount of teams to really be fair. So that was kind of the basis I laid out for all this.
So let's go left and work our way right across the landscape of college football and start in the Pac-12.
Yeah. So the Pac-12 is not a lot of change in the Pac-12. Things get a little bit more interesting as we move from here. But Pac-12, Colorado's out. We'll see where they go a little bit later. And Boise State is the first team that gets promoted up from the Group of 5 into power, major college football, we'll say. So Boise State obviously very deserving in that general footprint. I think that makes the most sense for them geographically, for sure. And I think with major conference, college football money, I think they could actually be quite competitive.
Of course, the Power 5 is better than the Group of 5. There's no question about that. I ran the numbers last year. They won 83 of 104 meetings between the two, but there's certainly Group of 5 programs that have established themselves as being better than a large percentage of the Power 5, and Boise State would be at the top of that list, and they've proven it for now 20 years. So I think that makes sense. They're popular enough. They've got a brand name and geographically work and play quite a few games in non-conference play right now against the Pac-12. So that works.
That's right. They're actually the only Group of 5 team that I've put into what closely resembles a Power 5 conference today. The others, as we'll see, will be in a new conference, but a conference that might be stronger than some current Power 5 conferences.
Okay, close to 10 years ago, the Pac-12 picked up Colorado from the Big 12, and the Big 12 was in some serious problems, losing a few other teams, Texas A&M, Missouri, and Nebraska, to the Big 10, but was saved by some additions that didn't necessarily make sense. So the Big 12 is obviously stuck there in the Midwest in regards to our geographic thoughts about what the Big 12 should look like, and you've brought it back more into that traditional landscape geographically.
Yeah, so as mentioned, Colorado is out of the Pac-12 into the Big 12, which goes back to their history, but also makes sense geographically, kind of connecting all that with a conference. You have BYU, who's currently independent. They've got a surprisingly strong history for younger fans who may not remember, but they were quite good back in the 80s. Have a bigger following than some folks out east might realize. So they also joined the Big 12. And then Texas A&M has only been in the SEC a handful of years, and they moved back to the Big 12, which I think is one of the best best moves of this whole realignment in terms of bringing back games people really want to see. You bring back Texas A&M annually. It makes sense. It's what's best for the game. I think people like to see that. So that puts them up to 13 teams. So one team's got to go, and that's West Virginia, which just doesn't connect to that conference geographically. It doesn't really make sense. And they've got some other teams, I think teams like Pittsburgh, that make a lot more sense for them to be playing every year. Teams of that nature in that general region. So we'll get to them later, but I think that it's a win-win, really.
And we can stay in the Midwest, but move further north to the Big Ten that obviously added most recently Maryland and Rutgers, added Nebraska as its big football addition. Went from 10 to 11 teams back in 1993 with the addition of Penn State. So the name Big Ten has no longer made any sense in regards to the number of teams in the conference, where the Big Ten now stands at 14 teams.
Right. So this is going to seem like it was real easy, but it wasn't. So Maryland and Rutgers are out, both actually splitting off to two different conferences, which we'll get to shortly. Where the real debate was Nebraska. Obviously they were formerly Big 12. Would be nice to see them moved back there, but with the desire to get Boise State into the Pac-12, Colorado had to move. There's really only one landing place that makes sense for Colorado if they move out of the Pac-12. So that's why Colorado went to the Big 12 and Nebraska stayed put in the Big 10. So Big 10, just kind of undo those East Coast ads that didn't make a whole lot of geographic sense. Those were done for TV markets. It's pretty awkward to see Maryland, Ohio State football and basketball. It doesn't make a ton of sense. I don't think anyone's happy about it aside from the money, the big windfall it brought Maryland. So I think this makes a lot more sense for everyone.
Yeah, and much like that West Virginia lack of connection to the Big 12, Rutgers and Maryland playing Nebraska as inside of a conference, not a whole lot of sense there, and there are certainly no historical ties there. So while we're staying close to status quo in the Big Ten, we'll go to another conference that is staying very close to what it currently stands before we really tear into things with your last two conferences. So let's go to the SEC.
Yeah, so the SEC, we already mentioned Texas A&M going to the Big 12. That gets them down to 13 teams. And then a lot of different ways we could have gone here. Missouri, former Big 12 team, could have gone that way. But actually, we took South Carolina out and we moved them to a conference that it's actually the only conference they've ever won. So we'll see where South Carolina went in just a second.
Yeah, let's do that with the ACC. 14 teams currently, much of that coming from the old Big East, and obviously a footprint along the Atlantic coast and rooted in the South as well.
Yeah, so maybe the toughest, trickiest, maybe the most controversial change here is South Carolina going to the ACC. As mentioned, they were in the ACC until 1971. It's the only conference they've won. They've never won the SEC. Makes a lot more sense geographically. This wasn't done from the Clemson fan perspective, but from the perspective of the best team in that conference, it really helps them out, helps Clemson out in terms of scheduling, in that they're not tying up one of their non-conference games with that rivalry game. Just like when Virginia Tech moved into the ACC, that opened up an extra slot for Virginia to schedule more interesting non-conference games. Does the same for Clemson, brings a rivalry game into the conference, improves general conference play. Now you've added a great rivalry game into conference play, and also they're close to North Carolina, they're close to NC State, Wake Forest, Duke, Georgia Tech, all those teams. It makes a lot of geographic sense, and it makes a heck of a lot more sense than them playing their SEC West rival of Texas A&M every year. So that's one ad, and the other one, Maryland was in the ACC through 2014. They moved away, purely a money move. This again brings geographic cohesiveness. They're about to become the northernmost school in a conference that, as we're about to talk about, is going to drop some new additions that were done for TV markets, not for certainly not for football, and don't make a ton of sense in terms of rivalry history or geographic cohesiveness. So the teams going out. Oh, go ahead.
Did you take any consideration with the other sports?
Mainly
men's basketball.
Yeah, so I mean, I think Maryland makes a lot more sense in the ACC in terms of basketball. I think that's maybe that's the biggest point. You got them playing Duke. You've got them playing Georgia Tech, all these teams they used to play instead of Ohio State and Nebraska and Penn State. A lot of teams that I don't think draw a lot of interest. I think if money being equal, I think Maryland fans would prefer being in the ACC. So in this scenario, we're saying it is, and I think that's a big win for Maryland.
So there's the current Power Five and some minimal 2 to 3 teams per conference additions and subtractions. Now we've got a whole other conference to talk about.
Yeah. So 4 teams going out of the ACC, and they come to this new conference. You can call it the Big East. I've called it the Eastern Athletic Conference because it's sort of underplaying it to call it the Big East. But Pittsburgh, Syracuse, Boston College, and Louisville all moving out of the ACC. It's a tough blow for the ACC to lose Louisville, but the goal of this project here isn't to strengthen the ACC. It's to build 6 conferences with 12 teams that make the most sense for college football as a whole. So Louisville also moving to the Eastern Athletic Conference. So you've got those 4 ACC teams. Conference is headlined by Notre Dame, though, with automatic bids. This would be the kind of the one catalyst that could push Notre Dame into a conference. They're currently in the ACC. This is after that agreement that would force Notre Dame into the ACC if they're join a conference. We're forward looking here. So Notre Dame joins this new EAC along with those 4 ACC schools. Navy also joins from the AAC, so that's a classic Notre Dame rival, which goes to Notre Dame's schedule every year. 4 other teams from the AAC: Cincinnati, Temple, UCF, and Memphis. And then the last 2 teams come from the Big 12 with West Virginia, who's actually geographically reasonably close to Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Louisville. Makes a lot more sense than all these teams in Texas. And then Rutgers, which again makes a lot more sense than the teams that Big 10. So that's your 12-team EAC. All those teams would be automatic qualifiers in a playoff, all 12-team conferences.
My main knock against the BCS, in addition to the culmination of the pairing of the championship game, was the actual inclusion of the Big East, which was an inferior football conference with only 7 teams at one time. And we had the likes of UConn winning one year and going to a Fiesta Bowl, and they were probably the 30th or 35th best team in the country playing in a BCS game. So I would have similar concerns about this conference not being quite as good as the other 5.
That's a fair challenge. I think one huge difference is Notre Dame is in this conference. Another point is it's got 4 teams in the ACC, which maybe that's more of that are currently in the ACC. That is, which maybe is more of a commentary on the current ACC than the Eastern Athletic Conference that we're talking about. But I think that aside from Clemson, which right now is on just an incredible run, probably 1 or 2 or 3 best teams in the entire country. If you don't benchmark them off the best team, I think this conference stacks up. I won't say better than the ACC, but I would say reasonably comparable to the ACC, maybe even the Pac-12.
So if it was difficult for anybody out there to follow along with the additions and subtractions, go down to the description section below. I've listed out the conference alignment right there, so you can see the complete format of what Ryan has laid out in his 6 conference alignment. And again, is there anything else to add? You would go with an 18 playoff once this was established, correct?
Yeah, I would say that in the reverse, though. I would love to see this realignment if there was an 18 playoff. As you know, and I think you disagree, but that's okay. I love the 14 playoff format as it currently stands. If it were to expand to 6 or 8, then I'd love to see a realignment like this. Then you do automatic bids. You bring, you're going to really devalue the regular season games by expanding the playoff. But by making 6 of them, 6 of 6 or 6 of 8 slots, automatic bids, you bring that value back. So I think this realignment is one way to do that. Also, especially as we're potentially entering tough economic times, especially for colleges, cutting costs could become important, and reducing travel, such as from Austin, Texas to Morgantown, West Virginia for a volleyball game, makes a lot of sense. So I think this reduces cost. Obviously, there'd have to be some sort of revenue sharing to pull some of this off. But I think it makes a lot of sense in that regard. Some of the other tough decisions that I didn't mention, and I'd love for you to weigh in on this. Teams that I would have loved to include but didn't: Army and Air Force. Navy got in there, but Army and Air Force didn't. Prime reason, or some of the main reasons, were location, really fitting in that Eastern Athletic Conference footprint and their rivalry with Notre Dame. Air Force, Houston, who I think has been really good, but there's just so many schools in Texas already, and really basically it was them or BYU. App State, although they're only in the Sun Belt, they're pretty good. It's just there's enough North Carolina teams in the ACC, and really kind of a stretch to force them into this Eastern Athletic Conference. And lastly, USF. They were awesome a handful of years ago, but if you're picking between UCF and USF, I think UCF is the clear winner there.
So fortunately for the 6 conferences that you have in play, it's not hurting major college football to be leaving those teams out. They're not going to be competing for national championships or anything close to that. I think it's possibly hurting their football brand as they attempt to ascend to that level. And I don't like to break up the 3 academies as well. I put together a format, and I did the same thing, though. I included 2 of the 3 instead of 1 of the 3. So I broke my own rule or my own preference there in trying to maintain those 3, because I put them on equal footing for a number of reasons. And their level of football play on the field has been pretty fair, pretty comparable. Absolutely. So to run through mine, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to release these videos later, so we're not going to run through mine. But Ryan and I have had these conversations through the years concerning the playoff scheduling and also conference alignment. And we found out the other day that our alignments are pretty aligned, if that makes any sense. So I put this together about 3 years ago, and it's eerily similar. So I added a 6th conference as well, called it the Big East, because I'm not as don't have as much ingenuity as Ryan does. So I just went back to the old Big East name. But in the Big 12, I put back in Texas A&M and Missouri. I also brought in Colorado. I kicked out West Virginia. I brought in Houston. So that's 3, 6, 7. I've got actually a 13-team Big 12, which works with the 9-game schedule. So if you want uniformity, I broke the rules slightly with a Big 12 of 13 teams. We're considering the Big 12, like the Big 10, a brand name. It's not actually teams in the conference. The Pac-12, I moved, again, Colorado to the Big 12. I brought in Boise State and BYU to play in the North. Boise State, the South, BYU.
So also 13 teams?
We got 13 teams in the Pac-12 as well.
We'll see if you stay uniform with 13 then. Let's keep going.
I think I might as well start adding more then, is what I should do, because the rest of the conferences have 12. So maybe I should look for teams to add. Then it would be a mess, that's for sure. Now, the Big Ten, I'm sold on Notre Dame being in the Big Ten, because when we talk about history, their series with Michigan, Michigan State, Northwestern, or Purdue used to be played each and every year. And geographically, of course, Notre Dame sits right in the middle of Big Ten country. So I kicked out Penn State, Rutgers, and Maryland out of the Big Ten, added Notre Dame, and we've got 2 6-team divisions there. In the SEC, that's the easiest to go with there. I just kicked out Texas A&M and Missouri. We've got 12 teams in the SEC. In the ACC, I booted, much like you, BC, Pitt, Syracuse, and Louisville, the northern teams out of the ACC and the newest additions to the ACC, which leaves us to 10 teams. So I added 2, both in Florida, South Florida, and Central Florida to the ACC, and I realigned the divisions slightly and matched up the rivalries of, let's say, North Carolina and North Carolina State in one division was one of my aims there. USF and UCF are in the same division as well. All right. In the newly founded Big East, Penn State out of the Big Ten, BC, Syracuse, Pitt, and Louisville out of the ACC. We've got Cincinnati and Temple out of the American Conference, along with Navy. We've got Army added, as well as West Virginia out of the Big 12, and Maryland and Rutgers out of the Big 10. So much like you, it needs its second-tier teams after Penn State to be strong, to be competitive with the other teams. So maybe my knock against the old Big East is something that I'm setting up once again. I would really take an approach toward non-conference scheduling in which I would make it fair. I would take it out of the hands of the schools. I would set up a committee, and the aim of the committee would be to comprise a non-conference schedule for every team in the country that would be based on building a composite 500 schedule from the previous season. meaning you could take any team schedule, Clemson's non-conference schedule for 2025, and the teams that they play would have a composite 500 conference record from the previous year. So everybody would have fair scheduling. Some people, when I explain it, call it NFL scheduling. It's not NFL scheduling, which is toward a bent toward parity, which is giving tougher
schedules to better teams.
Yes. I'm not doing that. I'm trying to create equality. And then we would have a big, like the NFL, which gets a lot of hype and a lot of talk when it releases its schedule each offseason. I would have a big schedule release on, let's say, May 1st. And there's no reason why we need to schedule games 12 and 13 years in advance. If Major League Baseball can schedule 162 games for 30 teams and all that travel, college football can certainly do it during an off season as well, with an 8-team playoff with, of course, 6 conference champions.
So 2 comments for you. First, on that non-conference scheduling, would you be able to take into consideration non-conference rivalries? Because although I think both of our conference setups do a good job of bringing back rivalries, like Texas A&M versus Texas, what about like a Georgia versus Clemson, or ones like that, Nebraska and some old rivals in the Big 12?
Well, when I took this a step further to see if it was practical, the rivalries that I took into question to see if they would work weren't necessarily those rivalries. They were the rivalries that we see scheduled each year between, let's say, the SEC and the ACC, Clemson, South Carolina, Georgia, Georgia Tech, Louisville, Kentucky, and Florida, Florida State. So, for example, if let's say everybody's playing a 9-game conference season, let's say South Carolina went 4-5 last year in the SEC, my scheduling committee would have to find a 5-4 team elsewhere to match with South Carolina.
So you would accommodate it. Okay. Only other comment, and this isn't so much a challenge, just kind of a comment. Your Big East versus my 6th conference, really similar. Big difference is Notre Dame versus Penn State at the top, and then where I have UCF and Memphis, you have Army and Maryland. Unless I missed it, Memphis didn't make the cut for you. Army didn't make the cut for me. Both kind of tough cuts, but you got to make the math work.
Yeah, they are. Maybe I look for the 13 across the board. And I got to tell you, I'm bothered by my 13 teams. Again, I did this 3 years ago, so I'm just dusting it off to see what I did 3 years ago. And with the 13 teams in 2 leagues, I'm not totally proud of this, but that's what I put together at the time.
Well, you can find 3 more teams to add in, and you'll have a perfectly uniform prime number, but it'll work with a 9-game conference schedule.
And I think both of us give it a perspective that we try not to get caught up in the moment, meaning Memphis is really good right now, and they've been good for 2 or 3 years. Memphis has been atrocious at times.
Yeah, I mean, they're not exactly a top priority to move up in the same extent that you would say a Boise State. So I don't think that's a terrible omission. Just highlighting some differences.
Absolutely.
And we did this totally independently, years apart, and our a lot of these moves that we made, pretty darn similar, and that just, I think, highlights just how much some of this stuff makes sense and is kind of logical.
All right, everyone out there, again, down in the description section below, you check out the conference format because it's difficult to follow in the course of the conversation. So I've got it all outlined there. That's Ryan's format right there. For 6 conferences, that would equal an 18 playoff as well. Good stuff.
Yeah,
Ryan, I like it.
Always fun. Thanks. Appreciate it.